Biblical scholars have argued for years about the location of these holy sites. Now, one man says he might have found them. Take a look.
We're about 4 miles from Jabal al-Lawz in Saudi Arabia, the ancient land of Midian. Jabal al-Lawz could be the real Mount Sinai.
For decades, one mountain in the deserts of Saudi Arabia was sealed off from the world. Ringed by barbed wire and armed guards, written off as an empty military zone no scientist could enter. If there was nothing out there, what were they guarding? Then in 2025, the silence finally cracked, and a single drone was allowed to fly across the peak, carrying equipment that can see straight through solid rock. And what it picked up beneath the surface was not stone, and it was not caves. It was something truly terrifying. The Forbidden Mountain. For most of modern history, you simply could not visit Jabal al-Lawz mountain. The Saudi government fenced the area off, posted guards, and listed it as a restricted military site. And the few outsiders who tried to slip in came back with only grainy photographs, if they came back at all, because several were arrested and thrown out of the country. Officially, there was nothing to see, just rock and sand and empty desert. The very few photographs that did leak out only deepened the mystery, and every request for a proper scientific permit came back denied. But a small number of researchers had spent decades insisting that this one mountain was among the most important places on Earth. They believed it was the real Mount Sinai, the peak where, according to the Bible, Moses stood before God and came down carrying the 10 Commandments. But they could never prove it, because the one country that could grant them access kept the gate locked and the lights off. Then, in 2025, something shifted. A private research team reportedly struck a deal with Saudi officials, and the terms were strict. No excavation, no boots on the ground, nothing touched. Just one drone flying a programmed path over the peak, carrying a kind of radar that militaries use to find bunkers and buried weapons hidden deep underground. The drone went up and the data came back, but when the image appeared on the screens, the room went completely silent, because the radar was not showing caves and it was not showing cracks in the rock. It was showing straight lines and right angles and rooms. But to understand why that single picture is so hard to explain away, you first have to understand how the world settled on a completely different mountain and why that mountain has a problem almost nobody likes to mention. The wrong mountain. For more than 1,500 years, the peak everyone has pointed to sits in Egypt, on the Sinai Peninsula, and it is called Jebel Musa. At its foot stands one of the oldest working monasteries on Earth, St. Catherine's, built in the 6th century on the orders of a Roman emperor, and every single day pilgrims climb its ancient steps to the summit, believing they are walking where Moses walked. Churches teach it, textbooks print it, and the claim is so old that to question it can feel almost like a sin. But here is the quiet problem. The Bible does not describe a calm granite hill. It describes a mountain on fire. In the book of Exodus, when God comes down onto Sinai, the peak burns, the ground shakes, and smoke rolls off it like smoke from a furnace. It reads less like a sunrise over a peaceful summit and more like a volcano waking up. Some scholars read that fire and smoke not as a real volcano, but as the glory of God, a vision rather than geology. But the theory's supporters point out that the language keeps circling back again and again to burning, to furnace heat, to a peak wrapped in flame. Now look at Jebel Musa. It is solid granite, dead rock, and surveyors have gone over it inch by inch and found no sign of fire, no scorched rock, and no volcanic history at all. Nothing that matches the violence written into Exodus. And there is a second, deeper problem, one of simple geography. The Bible says the Israelites crossed the sea and passed through the land of Midian on their way to the mountain of God, and Midian did not sit in Egypt. It lay east of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. Even the Apostle Paul, writing much later, placed Mount Sinai plainly in Arabia. So how did the world spend 15 centuries climbing a mountain on the wrong continent? The answer is not really about faith at all. It is about power, and it begins with a handful of monks and an emperor who needed a place for a story to live. The Mountain of Moses. In the 4th century, Christianity had just become legal across the Roman Empire, and almost overnight these holy journeys turned into an obsession. Believers wanted to stand in the places from Scripture and see them with their own eyes, and the church needed to give them somewhere to go. So when a small group of monks settled beneath a mountain in Egypt and said, "This is Sinai," very few people pushed back. An emperor later wrapped a fortress monastery around the spot to make it official, and once wealth and tradition and political weight had piled up behind it, challenging the location became almost unthinkable. Scholars simply built their maps around the assumption that the monks had been right. But 1,500 miles away, in Arabia, the mountain the Bible actually seemed to point toward had never been forgotten by the people who lived beside it. The local Bedouin tribes had a name for Jabal al-Lawz that they had carried for countless generations. They called it the Mountain of Moses. And starting in the 1980s, that quiet local tradition pulled in a handful of outsiders willing to risk a great deal to test it. A Tennessee man named Ron Wyatt slipped into the restricted zone with his sons and was arrested and held for more than 2 months. A few years later, a wealthy adventurer and a former police investigator named Bob Cornick crossed in illegally, climbed the peak, and photographed everything they could before they were forced back out. Others had gone before them and paid for it, detained, threatened, and deported, their notes and film taken at the border. Almost everything the outside world knew about this mountain had been smuggled out under threat of arrest. These were not university archaeologists with permits and funding. They were amateurs, treasure hunters, and believers, and mainstream scholars would later tear their methods to shreds. But what they carried home was genuinely hard to wave away, because piece by piece, it seemed to line up with the oldest story in the book. The evidence carved in stone. The summit beside Jabal al-Lawz is black, not lightly stained but darkened as though the stone had been through a furnace. To the explorers, that scorched black cap looked like a direct echo of Exodus, of a mountain that had burned. Move down to the base, and they found a huge boulder split cleanly in two, with a wide channel between the halves and old water erosion cut into the ground around it in one of the driest places on the planet, which called straight back to the story of Moses striking a rock until water poured out. Nearby, they pointed to a platform of cut and stacked stones that looked like an ancient altar, to rock carvings of bulls with people bowing before them that echoed the golden calf, and to long single rows of stones ringing the base like a boundary the people were forbidden to cross. Laid out all together, it is a genuinely striking list. But this is exactly where the other side of the argument has to be heard, because mainstream geologists and archaeologists have looked at every one of those features and come away unconvinced. The Black Summit, they say, is not scorched at all. It is simply the natural color of the volcanic rock that runs through that peak, and no fire from thousands of years ago would still stain a mountainside today. The split boulder is an ordinary result of erosion and frost, the kind found all over the world. The bull carvings are real, but that style of rock art appears right across ancient Arabia and, by most dating, was scratched into the stone centuries before any exodus could have happened. One respected expert on the ancient Middle East went through the whole case and dismissed it as a string of, in his words, monumental blunders. And yet even the doubters do not all fully agree. At least one careful scholar has said the physical evidence is far too thin to prove anything, while admitting in the same breath that of every candidate on the map, this Arabian peak may still be the single most convincing pick for the real Mount Sinai. In other words, the case is weak enough to reject, and strong enough that it simply refuses to die. So the surface evidence, depending entirely on who is describing it, is either a chain of stunning coincidences all pointing the same way, or a pile of perfectly natural rocks that hopeful people have read like shapes in the clouds. And for decades, that is precisely where the whole thing stalled. One side seeing the fingerprint of God, the other seeing plain desert geology with no way to break the tie. Underneath all of it sat the skeptics' deadliest question, the one that had sunk the Exodus story for a century. If any of this were true, then where is the evidence? The silence of the skeptics. For 100 years, skeptics have used that single question to knock the entire Exodus story flat. Where is the evidence? If millions of people really camped at the foot of a mountain for the better part of a year, then where are the fire pits, the broken pots, the tools, the graves, the mountains of waste that any enormous crowd leaves behind? The desert is empty, and that emptiness, they argue, is the proof that none of it ever happened. But archaeologists who actually study wandering desert peoples answer that this expectation is simply wrong. The Israelites in the story were not building a city. They lived in tents, and tents leave almost nothing behind. only a few shallow holes that erode away within a generation or two. They ate simple bread and whatever they carried, so they were not firing pottery by the ton, and the few vessels they did have would have cracked and scattered across hundreds of miles, mixing over 3,000 years with the scraps of every other group that ever crossed that same desert, until nothing could be told apart. Fire pits wash away. Ash blows off in the wind. In that dry heat, cloth and leather and bone and food all break down and disappear. Expecting a clear campsite to survive 3,000 years in open sand is, frankly, not how the desert works. Then there is Egypt. If the Exodus really shattered the most powerful kingdom on earth, skeptics ask, why is there not a single Egyptian word about it anywhere? But that argument leans on a mistake about how Egypt wrote its own history. Pharaohs carved their victories into stone and stayed completely silent about their defeats. They did not build monuments to defeat, and there is hard proof they went well beyond silence, that they actively erased whatever embarrassed them, scratching the names of rejected kings off the walls and tearing down the statues of a pharaoh whose religion they wanted forgotten. It happened to an entire line of foreign rulers who were driven out and then scrubbed from the record. And it happened to a king who tried to change the gods and was erased so completely that he was very nearly lost to history altogether. A regime willing to delete its own rulers would certainly never carve the story of a foreign god breaking it in half. So maybe the silence was never proof of nothing. Maybe the evidence was simply never going to survive on the surface, out in the open, where everyone had always been looking, which is the exact reason the drone was not built to study the surface. It was built to look straight through it. The forbidden scan. The radar the drone carried does something that sounds like science fiction but is real technology. It fires energy down into the ground and reads what bounces back, and the more advanced versions can map shapes buried under as much as 100 feet of solid rock, then build them into a solid picture of what is hidden below. It is the same basic idea armies use to hunt for tunnels and bunkers. A single pass can turn a wall of solid stone into a kind of X-ray, showing voids and shapes that no human eye could ever reach from the surface. So the team flew it back and forth across the peak and waited for the results. According to the account that has come out, what came back was not a jumble of natural gaps in the rock. The radar drew rectangular rooms sitting in grid patterns, with walls that met at clean right angles, and corridors running between rooms in a layout that looked planned. And that is the detail that stops people cold, because nature does not build right angles. Erosion carves curves. Earthquakes create chaos. A perfect 90-degree corner buried underground points to only two things: human hands or something for which no one has an easy explanation. The readings, the story goes, placed these rooms around 40 feet down, buried under ages of landslide and blown sand. And the scale is the part that is hardest to shrug off. This was not one small, hidden room. The scan reportedly traced a network of spaces stretching more than 300 feet, something close to the size of a football field, sealed and intact beneath the mountain. The team is said to have flown the path again and again, reset the sensors and checked for false signals, and the shapes held every time. Whatever the radar was bouncing off down there, it was not random, and it was not moving. Skeptics will point out correctly that radar can be fooled, and that geology can fake a straight edge more often than believers would like. But if even part of it is real, then the skeptic's oldest question just got a chilling answer. The evidence for what happened at this mountain was never missing. It was underground the entire time. And that opens a far stranger question. What exactly would anyone go to the trouble of sealing beneath a mountain in the middle of the desert? What lies in the vault? This is where the story steps past archaeology and into what many people would openly call a guess, because there are researchers who look at those sealed rooms and think about the one object that, according to the Bible, was built on this very mountain and then vanished from history without a trace: the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was made at Sinai, a chest of acacia wood covered in pure gold, holding the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. It traveled with the Israelites for generations, sat in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and then, at some point before the Babylonians burned that temple to the ground, it simply disappeared. There is no account of it being captured and no record of it being destroyed. The most sacred object in the entire religion just drops out of the story, and for more than 2,000 years, people have hunted for it everywhere, in Ethiopia, in Egypt, under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and never found so much as a trace. In one Ethiopian town, an entire church claims to guard it to this day, watched over by a single monk who is never allowed to leave the grounds, and never allowed to let another living soul lay eyes on it. But here is the thought that will not let go. What if it never left the place where it was made? Picture the kingdom collapsing and the temple about to fall, and priests desperate to hide the one thing they could never let an enemy touch. Where do you take something that must never be found? Not to a city that will be sacked. You take it to the one place no invader would ever think to look, and no local would ever dare disturb. The sacred Forbidden Mountain, hundreds of miles out in the wilderness. Seal it into a room cut deep in the rock, and it could sit there untouched for as long as it needed to. Is that proof? No. It is a possibility, a remote and hotly argued one, and honest researchers say so plainly. But it is a possibility that the radar, if it is right, makes it very hard to laugh off completely. Because even setting the ark aside, someone at some point appears to have cut deliberate rooms into the base of a scorched mountain in the emptiest desert on Earth. And the only story anyone has ever told that could explain a place like that was written down thousands of years ago. The memory in the stone. So step back and ask the real question. If this genuinely is the mountain, why did the true location survive out in the Arabian desert while the whole world came to worship the wrong peak in Egypt? The answer may come down to memory. The Bible drops a strange hint that this mountain was already holy before Moses ever arrived, because at the burning bush God tells him to take off his sandals, for the ground he is standing on is already holy ground, not about to become holy. Already holy, sacred to someone, long before the Israelites ever came. And there are real people who fit that gap perfectly. Moses, before any of this, had spent 40 years living among the Midianites, married to a Midianite woman, working for her father, who was a Midianite priest. If the Midianites already held a certain mountain sacred, then Moses would have known exactly which peak he was being called to. And archaeology backs up at least this much, because the valleys around Jabal al-Lawz are full of genuine Midianite remains, their own kind of pottery, their copperworks, their old trade routes, a real and skilled people who knew every rock in that landscape, and who would absolutely have built stories around the one blackened, unnatural peak standing over all the others. That is the heart of the whole idea. The people who lived beside the real mountain never forgot it, and passed its name down, parent to child, across 100 generations, while 1,500 miles away, a group of newcomers pointed at a convenient hill and simply declared it the place. For centuries, Western scholars brushed those desert traditions aside as folklore and superstition, trusting a monastery raised by outsiders over the memory of the people who had never left. And that, the theory's supporters argue, is exactly how the world ended up kneeling at the wrong mountain for so long. It is a genuinely strong argument, but it is also, in the end, still an argument because the mountain itself is not talking. It sits behind its fence, the scan remains unconfirmed, the mainstream still firmly disagrees, and no one has been allowed to put a single shovel in the ground. And maybe that is the most honest place to leave it. The radar has shown an outline, not an answer. The faint shape of something beneath a mountain the world spent centuries refusing to look at. Cracking those rooms open would either be the greatest archaeological discovery in human history or the most expensive disappointment ever recorded. And right now, nobody is being allowed to find out which. So tell me, what do you truly believe is buried under that mountain? Ancient proof that the Exodus really happened? The lost Ark itself? Or nothing at all but empty desert rock and wishful thinking? Because the mountain has kept its secret for 3,000 years, and it does not seem to be in any hurry to give it up.